Just a nurse. That's what they called her when they thought she couldn't hear. Just a nurse with discount scrubs from the clearance bin at Target, moving through St. Michael's Hospital in Denver like she was trying to disappear into the walls themselves. They didn't know her hands had held soldiers' lives together in the Hindu Kush. They didn't know that the woman charting in the ICU had a silver star folded in her locker, the only proof that Captain Brooke Sullivan had ever existed at all. The Pentagon erased her records after the operation collapsed. The order was absolute: disappear, vanish, become invisible, and if anyone asks, you never served. 23 months she'd been following that order. 23 months of hunched shoulders and downcast eyes and the kind of practiced invisibility that comes from survival training, not from nursing school. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead as she moved through the unit corridor, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her name tag faded from 3 years of washing. Brooke Sullivan, RN. The rank was gone. The call sign was gone. Everything that mattered was erased. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, that particular blend of bleach and human suffering that never quite washed out of the walls. Her daughter Emma was in 4th grade now, 10 years old, and she still asked why Mommy had nightmares. Brooke told her it was just work stress. She'd gotten good at lying to her daughter. Dr. Pierce watched her from the nurse's station as she approached the medication cart, his eyes tracking her movements with the intensity of a predator calculating distance. He was 58, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that came with a trust fund, old money, Yale Med School, the surgical director of the unit for the past 7 years. He'd been running insurance fraud for 18 months now, inflating surgical billing by roughly 40%, pocketing kickbacks from a medical device company in exchange for overusing their stents and implants. $600,000 in unmarked deposits. Brooke had seen the billing codes during her routine charting, cross-referenced them against the actual procedures, noted the discrepancies in the post-op orders. Her meticulous attention to detail, the same precision that had kept soldiers alive in hostile territory, was now documenting patterns that would destroy him. She didn't know he'd noticed her noticing. She would find out soon enough. She pulled a pre-filled syringe from the cart, checked the label against the medication administration record, and moved toward room for 12 where an 82-year-old man lay post-op from a knee replacement, his vitals stable, his pain managed. This was her world now. Vital signs and med times and the small mercies of easing suffering in measured doses. The work was honest. The work was good. The work was nothing like what she'd been trained for, and that was precisely why she'd chosen it. At 2:19 p.m., the intercom crackled. Code blue, Trauma Bay 4. Her shoulders stiffened for exactly 1 second, then relaxed. She'd trained herself not to respond to overhead announcements anymore. That wasn't her job. She handed the medication to the aide covering her patients and continued her shift documentation, her jaw set in the practiced stillness that kept her invisible. But the sounds of the code pulled at something deeper, the hiss of oxygen, the rhythm of compressions, the sharp electrical snap of the defibrillator paddles charging. Muscle memory. Her hands tightened on the pen in her grip. The kind of tightness that came from restraint, not weakness. What happened next came down to timing and chance and the random cruelty of hospital rotations. The visiting combat medic, Major Tom Halloway from the 75th Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning, in Denver for a trauma symposium, was standing near Trauma Bay 4 when the patient crashed. 37-year-old construction worker, blast injury to the left anterior thoracic wall, tension pneumothorax developing, O2 sat dropping from 94 to 87 to 78. The trauma surgeon was elbow-deep in another case. The resident froze. The attending from surgical critical care was 2 floors up. The clock was ticking down. Brooke didn't hesitate. She was there in seconds, her hands already moving, already knowing what needed to happen, needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, 1 fluid motion, the 14-gauge angiocath needle sliding through skin and muscle and fascia until the distinctive hiss of air escaped, the sound of a lung re-expanding, of pressure releasing, of a man not dying. Her hands moved like someone who'd done this in the dark under fire, muscle memory burning bright beneath clinical precision. The resident stepped back. The attending from trauma didn't ask permission because Brooke's movements didn't ask for permission, they commanded it. 02 Sack climbed. 78. 82. 88. Stable. She had the patient prepped for chest tube insertion in 90 seconds flat, her movements economical, purposeful, the kind of efficiency that couldn't be learned in any accredited nursing program. Major Holloway stood motionless near the door, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee cup. His face had gone pale. He recognized that technique. Not the textbook version they taught in trauma courses. The field expedient version, the one you only learned when you were operating outside a surgical suite, when you were working by flashlight in a compound in the Hindu Kush, when every second counted because medevac was 40 minutes out and the patient would be dead in 12. The room went silent. The resident was staring at her. The trauma surgeon who'd rushed down had stopped in the doorway. Brooke didn't acknowledge any of them. She was already turning away, already becoming invisible again, already pulling the curtain back around the patient to give them privacy. The code was stabilizing. The patient would live. Someone else's name would go on the report. Someone else would be credited. She'd written enough false reports for the Pentagon to understand how that worked. "I need some jello," she said quietly to the nearest aide, her voice flat and unremarkable. The aide nodded, already forgetting her face. Major Holloway followed her into the hallway, his boots making soft thuds against the tile floor. He was 6'2", built like someone who'd spent a decade humping rucks through mountains, and his eyes had that particular intensity of someone who'd seen combat. He caught her elbow gently, not aggressively, the way you might touch someone you didn't want to startle. "Needle decompression at the midclavicular line," he said quietly. "Under 10 seconds. Perfect hand positioning. I know that technique." Brooke didn't stop walking. She pulled her arm back, not roughly, just firmly, and kept her voice even, modulated, the careful neutral tone of someone with nothing to offer. "I learned it in nursing school," she said. "It's standard protocol." "Bullshit." Holloway's voice was gentle but certain. "Standard protocol is surgical consult first. Standard protocol is waiting for the trauma attending. Where did you serve?" The hallway stretched ahead of her, fluorescent lights casting everything in pale wash. She could feel his eyes on her face, searching for something, recognition, acknowledgement, the crack in her carefully constructed facade. Her heart rate had spiked, but her breathing stayed even, controlled, the way she'd been trained to breathe when every decision mattered. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Hindu Kush. That's where I saw that move," Holloway pressed, his voice still quiet, still gentle. "Sanjin Valley, 2019. Extraction operation. 12 hostages. I remember because everyone who was there remembers. And I remember a captain who moved exactly like you just did. Who extracted everyone without losing a single person. Who then vanished. Completely erased. I've spent for years wondering what happened to her." Brooke stopped walking. For exactly 3 seconds, she stood motionless, her hand still around the medication cart, her back to Holloway, her shoulders a single perfect line of tension. Pain was information. The burning sensation across her chest was the sensation of her carefully constructed world developing a hairline fracture. "You're mistaken," she said. Her voice was quieter than before. "I'm just a nurse." She turned and met his eyes for exactly 1 second, and in that second, he saw it, the recognition, the confirmation, the legend behind the scrubs. Her gaze held the particular flat quality of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, made decisions that couldn't be unmade, buried a life that couldn't be resurrected. "I have patients to check," she said, and turned back toward the unit. Holloway didn't follow her. He stood in the middle of the hallway, his coffee cup forgotten, his military-trained mind racing through the implications of what he'd just witnessed. A classified asset was working as a civilian nurse in a hospital in Denver. A soldier who'd been erased from every database was moving through civilian life under her real name, drawing a salary, paying taxes, trying to be invisible. And somewhere in this building, a man was about to discover exactly how much danger he was in for threatening her. Brooke returned to the medication cart with the precision of someone whose hands had learned not to shake, not under fire, not under interrogation, not under the weight of a folded flag kept hidden in a hospital locker. The Pentagon's order echoed in her mind like a mantra: disappear, vanish, become invisible. She'd been doing it for 23 months. She'd been doing it so well that nobody had seen her at all. But somebody had just seen her. And the machinery that had been dormant since the operation in the Hindu Kush had just started turning again. Room 614 smelled of antiseptic and fear. The elderly woman in the bed had undergone a sigmoid resection 6 hours earlier, and her 3 adult children, 2 sons and a daughter, all wearing the exhausted uniform of people who'd flown in from out of state, sat clustered around her like a perimeter defense. Brooke stood at the foot of the bed, her hand steady as she explained the post-operative protocol, pain management timing, when to expect bowel function to return, the warning signs of infection that would require immediate callback to the surgical team. The daughter, a woman with grey at her temples and a notebook in her lap, was taking notes. The eldest son nodded, absorbing information the way people do when they're terrified but trying not to show it. Brooke had done this 43 times this month alone. The words came without thought, her voice level and warm, the practiced tone of someone who understood that families in this state needed reassurance more than clinical precision. She was explaining the importance of early mobilization when the door burst open hard enough to bounce off the wall. Dr. Pierce filled the doorway like a storm system advancing. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. His voice came first, sharp and contemptuous: "Mrs. Sullivan." A word. Now. She turned. Her face didn't change. Not a flicker of reaction. The combat stillness took over, shoulders relaxed, hands loose at her sides, the particular kind of neutral that comes from learning not to flinch when rounds are incoming. She'd been shot at in the Paktia province. She could handle a voice raised in a hospital room. "Can you explain to me," Dr. Pierce said, stepping closer, his volume climbing with each word, "why you don't understand standard protocols?" The family exchanged looks. The daughter's pen stopped moving. "Because I'm looking at your charting and I'm genuinely concerned about your basic competence." He pulled out a chart, her chart, holding it up like evidence at a trial. "You administered Dilaudid without a co-signature. You documented a medication I never ordered. Are you fabricating records, or do you simply not know how to do your job?" 5 seconds of silence stretched across the room like a living thing. "I don't know where you trained," he continued, his voice dropping into that particular register of contempt that made the daughter pull her phone out. "Recording now," Brooke noticed, "but at St. Michael's we follow protocols." "Do I need to explain them smaller? Use simpler words? Would that help? Charity case." The nickname landed like a punch. It was supposed to. That was the whole architecture of it, said loud enough for the family to hear, public enough that it would spread through the unit like infection through an open wound. Charity case. As in, she must have gotten her nursing degree from some charity program. As in, she wasn't qualified. As in, she didn't belong. The room held its breath. Brooke met his eyes. Not defensive. Not angry. Just flat, completely emptied of emotion, the stare of someone looking at a problem that needed solving. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, which made it carry further somehow. A man who needs to scream usually has nothing worth hearing. She turned and walked away. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud. Dr. Pierce sputtered. Actually sputtered. His face flushed crimson, rage and humiliation mixing into something that made him look momentarily unhinged. He said her name twice, but she was already down the hallway, moving at the pace of someone with nowhere urgent to be, which meant she was moving very fast indeed. The family stood frozen. The daughter kept her phone recording. The eldest son looked at his mother, still pale from surgery, eyes wide, and said quietly, "What the hell was that?" Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway for 7 more seconds, breathing hard, before he turned and left. The chart was crumpled in his hand. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the entire unit knew what had happened. Hospital information traveled through the break room with the velocity of a disease vector, each retelling getting slightly sharper, slightly more dramatic. Charity Case talked back to Dr. Pierce. Charity Case made him look foolish. Charity Case was done. The consensus was immediate and total. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Brooke sat alone in the break room at 1:41 p.m., eating a turkey sandwich that tasted like nothing. She'd returned from her rounds with the quiet efficiency of someone compartmentalizing, which was a skill she'd learned in the Hindu Kush and refined over 4 years of hiding. The break room was half full when she entered, 4 nurses sitting together, Sarah from ICU scrolling through her phone, Marcus from the day shift getting ready to leave. They all looked up at her entrance. None of them looked away quickly enough to be subtle about it. Brooke opened her Tupperware, turkey on wheat, carrot sticks, a handful of grapes that had been browned 3 days ago. She didn't make eye contact. Didn't acknowledge the sudden drop in conversation, the shift in the room's gravity. She just sat down in the folding chair at the end of the table and opened her lunch. Sarah stood up immediately. "Oh, I gotta get going. I'm actually done." She gathered her untouched salad, her phone, her water bottle. She didn't look at Brooke. Then Marcus. "Yeah, I gotta catch my kids from school." His break was supposed to last another 20 minutes. Then the other 3, in sequence, like dominoes falling. They collected their things in silence. They left their conversations unfinished. The break room, which had been warm with chatter 30 seconds earlier, became a space of clinical emptiness. Just Brooke and her turkey sandwich and the fluorescent lights humming their electric monotone above her head. She ate mechanically. Chewed. Swallowed. Carrot. Grape. Didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't let the silence crack anything that couldn't be repaired. The mask held. The composure held. She had learned in places where the cost of breaking was measured in body bags and letters to next of kin, and she would not break here because of a hospital break room and a handful of nurses who were afraid of the social consequences of proximity to someone Dr. Pierce had decided to destroy. By the end of her shift, the write-up was posted on the unit board. She found it at 3:23 p.m. while searching for the supply order log. The paper was cream-colored, official letterhead, her name in bold at the top in the kind of font that made you take it seriously. The document was brief and devastating, formal notice of insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Witnessed by 4 staff members. Recommended remediation, immediate review of nursing protocol competency. Submitted by Dr. Marcus Pierce, Medical Director. Her name was listed. The date and time were listed. The fact that she had disrespected a physician in front of a patient's family was listed, though it was phrased more carefully than that, engaged in verbally inappropriate conduct of a condescending nature toward a supervising physician. Technically accurate. Technically constructed in a way that made her look like the aggressor, the one who had lost control. She took the paper down. Folded it once. Folded it again. She would need to keep it, probably. Would need it for some future conversation with the hospital administrator, assuming she survived to have that conversation. She slipped it into the back pocket of her scrubs, next to the folded flag from Rodriguez, the only other thing she kept close to her body at work. A nursing assistant walked past the board, Brandon, new to the unit, eager to prove himself by whatever method the ecosystem of the hospital required. He read the notice with his eyes widening, then turned to his colleague with a whisper meant to carry, "Charity Case is finally getting what she deserves." Brooke heard it. Everyone heard it. She was restocking the med cart in the supply room when the words reached her, traveling through the open door like a physical thing. She didn't flinch. Didn't pause in her methodical placement of 4 bags and saline flushes into their designated slots. She kept working with the kind of precision that suggested nothing had landed, nothing had stuck, nothing had touched the armor she'd constructed over the last 4 years of disappearing into a role that wasn't her. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made her hand shake for exactly 3 seconds in the privacy of the supply room, a trembling that wasn't fear but something closer to restraint, the compressed energy of someone holding the line between control and the kind of response that would end careers. The worst part was simpler and more final: she was alone now. Actually alone. The kind of isolation that comes not from physical distance but from professional ostracism, from becoming the person that good people avoided because the cost of association had become too high. She finished the med cart at 4:15 p.m. She charted her notes at 4:40 p.m. She gave her shift report to the night nurse at 5:12 p.m., speaking in the flat, professional voice of someone reading from a script. The night nurse, Jennifer, listened without making eye contact, which meant word had traveled there too. Jennifer was competent. Jennifer had been friendly. Jennifer was now performing the careful distance of someone who understood that being kind to charity case would make her charity case adjacent, and that status came with consequences. Brooke clocked out at 5:27 p.m. The parking lot was already transitioning to evening, the sun hanging low over Denver, turning the sky the color of a bruise. She walked to her car, a 2008 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had stopped meaning anything to her around mile 160,000. She sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes without starting the engine, her hands on the steering wheel, looking out at the hospital building, cream-colored brick and glass, all those lit windows full of people doing the work of keeping other people alive. She thought about room 614 and the daughter recording on her phone. She thought about the break room silence. She thought about the write-up with her name in bold letters, now officially part of her employment record at St. Michael's Hospital in Denver. She thought about Dr. Pierce in his office, already on the phone probably, already building the next layer of whatever structure he was constructing, the strategic moves that came after the public humiliation, the careful weaponization of every hospital policy he could twist into a noose. And that's when the call came through the hospital radio, the one mounted in her car from when she'd briefly volunteered with the disaster response team before getting quietly discouraged from that work too. All available medical personnel, we have a priority alert. Combat-related casualty incoming to the ER. ETA for minutes. Trauma team activation. Her hand moved to the ignition before her brain caught up. Military training overrides everything else, the muscle memory that had been buried but never dead, just dormant, waiting for the right frequency to activate. For minutes. A combat casualty. A Fort Carson soldier probably, wounded in some training accident or... She should drive home. She should not get involved. She should let the ER handle it. She should keep her head down and avoid any situation that might give Dr. Pierce more ammunition, more documented evidence of stepping outside her lane, her scope, her carefully constructed invisibility. She started the car anyway and pulled back toward the emergency bay. What she didn't know, what nobody at St. Michael's Hospital knew yet, was that the casualty being wheeled into the ER in exactly 4 minutes was a 26-year-old combat medic from Fort Carson named Specialist Tyler Hayes, currently assigned to the 4th Battalion, 10th Special Forces Group out of Fort Carson, Colorado. What nobody knew was that he'd been part of a training exercise that went wrong in the mountains north of Boulder. What nobody knew was that he was currently suffering from a tension pneumothorax that was compressing his heart and lungs, his oxygen saturation plummeting toward the threshold where the body simply stops working. And what the ER resident didn't know, when Brooke appeared in the trauma bay wearing her coat over her street clothes, looking like a phantom in the fluorescent brightness, was that this patient's injury would trigger something in her that Dr. Pierce had been systematically trying to provoke, the moment when the mask would slip, when the composure would crack just enough to expose the woman underneath, the one with captain's bars hidden in a locker, the one who'd extracted hostages under fire. The one whose hands remembered things no civilian nurse should ever know how to do. The code alert sounded. The doors burst open. And Brooke Sullivan, the invisible nurse in Denver, walked directly into the moment that would unravel everything she'd spent for years constructing. The ER doors slid open and the paramedics came through fast, moving with the controlled urgency of people who'd learned not to panic. Stretcher. Male. 20s, maybe early 30s. Civilian clothes, jeans, hiking boots, a North Face jacket already cut open. The radio chatter had been sparse: training accident, Fort Carson, massive internal bleeding, ETA 3 minutes, critical. Brooke was restocking the crash cart when she heard the overhead page. Code trauma. Bay 4. She knew the number without thinking. Muscle memory. Her hands moved toward the cabinet before her brain caught up, grabbing hemostatic gauze, saline boluses, 2 units of O-negative from the fridge she kept mentally catalogued at all times. The type that saved lives when you had minutes and no information. The patient came in like a storm, pale, respiration shallow, blood pressure dropping. 110/70. Then 98/60. His left side was distended, rigid. Internal bleeding. Spleen, maybe liver. The ER attending, Dr. Reeves, was already barking orders. 2 large-bore 4s. Type N cross. Get me 3 units PRBC, stat. Brooke moved to the bedside. The patient's eyes were half closed, pupils blown wide. Shock. His hands were trembling, not fear. Hyperventilation. Adrenaline dump from whatever had happened at Fort Carson. She'd seen soldiers in this state before. The specific kind of tremor that came from rapid deceleration, from impact trauma at high velocity. "What's his name?" Dr. Reeves asked. One of the paramedics shook his head. "No ID." Wally wasn't with him. They found him on the training grounds, nobody saw what happened. He was alone. John Doe. Unidentified. Brooke's jaw tightened. The kind of case that meant complicated paperwork, meant questions, meant attention from departments that asked questions about liability and protocol. Blood type. Dr. Reeves was already reaching for the ultrasound probe. Unknown. Still running the panel. "He's losing too much," Dr. Reeves said flatly. Type O negative. 3 units, now. Brooke was already moving. The blood bank was down the corridor, 90 seconds away if you walked fast. 2 minutes if you wanted to be careful. They didn't have 2 minutes. The patient's pressure had dropped to 85/50. His skin was cold, clammy, the color of old concrete. Hemorrhagic shock. Minutes until organs started failing. Minutes until his heart stopped trying. She was halfway to the blood bank when she stopped. Turned around. The blood bank could wait. The patient could wait 90 seconds for O negative. But there was a faster way. She walked back to Bay 4. Dr. Reeves was finishing the fast exam, focused assessment with sonography. Positive. Massive free fluid in the abdomen. The patient needed surgery, needed the OR, needed someone to open him up and stop the bleeding before his body had nothing left. But he needed blood first. Brooke stood at the edge of the patient's vision. "I'm O negative," she said. Her voice was steady, the way it always was. The way it had been trained to be in situations where steadiness mattered. Dr. Reeves looked up from the ultrasound. "We have units coming. He won't make it in 90 seconds. The room had gone quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone knows what you're suggesting and nobody wants to say it out loud. A nurse donating blood for a patient was not protocol. It was also not illegal. It was the kind of thing that happened in emergencies when people stopped thinking about liability and started thinking about whether someone was going to die. The patient's oxygen saturation was 88. Dropping. 2 units, Brooke said. "We can have them in 20 minutes if the blood bank rushes the crossmatch." Dr. Reeves held her eyes for 2 seconds. Then nodded. The procedure was fast. Brooke sat in the adjacent bay while a phlebotomy tech with shaking hands inserted a needle, 16 gauge, smooth, and 2 units of her blood-filled collection bags. Her pressure dropped slightly. Dizzy. Cold. The specific cold that came from losing blood volume, from her body understanding it was down 4% of its total. She'd donated before, overseas, in forward surgical tents where the distinction between medical personnel and treated patients blurred into irrelevance. She kept her eyes on the John Doe patient while her blood ran into the collection bags. His face was pale, sharp-featured, jaw clenched even under sedation. She was still trying to place him, the feeling of recognition that wasn't quite forming, a door in her memory that wouldn't quite open. Something about the way his hands were positioned, fingers curled as if gripping something invisible. Something about the scars on his forearms, thin white lines that ran parallel to the bone, the specific pattern left by rope burns. High-altitude rappelling. The kind of burns that came from fast ropes in thin air, from operations in terrain where gravity was a secondary threat. Hindu Kush. 2019, Sanjin Valley. But she couldn't place him. Couldn't match the face to any name she was allowed to remember. The phlebotomy tech withdrew the needle. "You okay?" "Fine," Brooke said. Her word count was down to necessities. Her voice had dropped an octave. Her blood was rushed to the blood bank. 20 minutes became 15. The units came back cross-matched and safe, and she watched them run into the patient's full line. Warmed. Running fast. 2 units of her blood, carrying oxygen and clotting factors, reaching into his tissues and fighting back the shock. His pressure climbed. 90/60. 100/70. The color returned to his skin. The tremor in his hands eased. Whatever was happening inside his abdomen, the bleeding, the damage, was still there, still critical, still requiring surgery. But his body had time now. His organs had time. Her blood had bought him maybe 30 minutes before the OR would need to take him. She stood at the foresight, holding gentle pressure where the needle had gone in, and studied his face again. The scar tissue along his left temple. The way his breathing synchronized with the ventilator, not panicked, but controlled. Trained breathing. The kind you learned when you trained your body to stay calm when everything inside you was screaming to panic. She'd trained that way once. The doors to Bay 4 opened. Dr. Pierce entered. His face went through several expressions in sequence: concern, calculation, then something that looked like frustration mixed with fear. He looked at the patient. Then at Brooke. Then at the transfusion running warm into the fall line. His jaw tightened. "Brooke. Step aside." She didn't move. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for moments when he wanted to make a point without witnesses hearing it. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're reassigned, effective immediately. Orthopedic floor. Your shift ends at 3, and you're not coming back to critical care." She turned to face him. Her eyes were level. Flat. No. That wasn't a request. His voice had taken on that edge, the edge she'd heard in military officers about to invoke rank, about to make something official. Hospital policy requires rotation assignments to prevent burnout. You've been in this unit for 180 consecutive days. That violates protocol. She knew the protocol he was referencing. It was real, a guideline, not a rule, designed to prevent staff exhaustion. She'd never heard it enforced before. She'd certainly never heard it used as grounds for reassignment mid-shift. "He needs continuity," she said. "I started his transfusion. Dr. Reeves can manage the transfusion." Pierce's eyes kept drifting back to the patient, to the monitor showing stabilizing vitals, to the fall line running her blood into his veins. "This isn't about protocol, and we both know it. This patient draws attention. Attention means questions. Questions mean auditors looking at billing codes, looking at incident reports, looking at things that don't need looking at. So you're going to orthopedics, you're going to keep your head down, and you're going to stop making yourself visible in my unit." He said it quietly. He said it like he was explaining hospital policy. Like this was procedure and not punishment. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator pump its breath into the patient's lungs. Brooke didn't respond. She simply turned back to the patient and adjusted the fall line, checking the infusion rate, checking the color of the blood running into his arm. Pierce waited another 5 seconds, then left. His footsteps echoed down the corridor. Fast, angry footsteps. Dr. Reeves appeared at the curtain. "You okay?" "Yes," Brooke said. It was true, and it wasn't. She was fine. She was also watching the beginning of something, the way you could feel a storm coming by the way the air pressure changed. The patient's pressure remained stable through the next hour. 115/75. Oxygenation climbing. The OR was prepped. Surgery was scheduled for 30 minutes from now. The trauma surgeon had arrived, Dr. Chen, one of the good ones, the kind who knew that internal bleeding didn't care about hospital politics. He reviewed the FAST exam and the CT images and made the call: spleen laceration, grade 4, probably not salvageable. They'd go in, they'd stop the bleeding, they'd remove what needed removing. Standard trauma protocol. Except for the John Doe part. Except for the fact that nobody knew who this patient was or how he'd gotten injured at a place like Fort Carson, the massive army installation south of the Springs that officially dealt with training and unofficially dealt with things that required careful handling. Brooke was walking toward the break room when she saw the first incident report. Posted on the unit board, printed on official hospital paper, dated 4 hours earlier. Her name at the top. She didn't read it. Not yet. She could feel her blood pressure climbing, the specific response that came from seeing your name in official documentation tied to accusations. But her face didn't change. Her breathing didn't change. She'd learned a long time ago how to compartmentalize the feeling and just move past it. The report stayed on the board for exactly 90 minutes before someone, probably a charge nurse who understood the game being played, removed it. But there would be copies. There were always copies. And if there was one report, there would be others. That was how institutional destruction worked. You didn't try to dismantle someone in one big move. You filed a report. Then another. Then another. You built a paper trail so thorough that by the time you fired them, it looked like they'd been inadequate all along. Brooke clocked out at 3. 12-hour shift, 2 units of blood donated, 1 John Doe patient stabilized, 1 reassignment threatened, 1 incident report filed. The math was simple. The trajectory was clear. But as she walked to her car in the Denver afternoon heat, she kept thinking about the patient's scars. The specific pattern of rappelling rope burns. The way his hands had gripped the stretcher rails like they were still holding a weapon. The look in his eyes during those moments before the sedation took hold, not fear, but recognition. Like he'd seen something in her face and understood. She had no idea what she'd seen in his. The folded flag was in her locker at home, still pressed in its triangular shape, still carrying the weight of everything it represented. She hadn't opened it in 4 years. Didn't plan to. Some things stayed buried because they had to. Some things refused to stay buried because they simply wouldn't. The soldier's chest stopped rising at 14:37 on a Tuesday afternoon. His oxygen saturation plummeted from 94 to 78 in 4 seconds. The ventilator alarm screamed. His pupils dilated. Blood pressure crashed to 52/0. Attention pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural cavity, collapsing his lungs from the inside, suffocating him while machines shrieked their helplessness around him. The ER team froze. Dr. Pierce was in radiology. The attending was in a meeting. The resident was 6 minutes away. The respiratory therapist stared at the monitor as if it might change if she concentrated hard enough. Brooke moved. She didn't think about protocols. She didn't think about scope of practice or Dr. Pierce's written warnings or the suspension letter already being drafted 3 floors above. She thought about Kandahar Province, August 2019. A soldier named Marcus with shrapnel in his lung, breathing in short panic gasps because his own body was killing him, and the nearest helicopter was 30 minutes out, and she was the only one who could save him. She thought about the pen barrel. The scalpel blade. The incision she'd made that took 3 seconds and changed everything. Muscle memory didn't ask for permission. She grabbed a 14-gauge for catheter from the crash cart. Tore open a scalpel packet. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. She located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her motor cortex from 2 previous field cricothyrotomies in the Hindu Kush, when medevac was impossible and soldiers were dying in her arms. The skin was warm. Slightly moist. Her fingers found the cricothyroid membrane as if guided by invisible GPS. One incision. The scalpel went through tissue with barely any resistance. Blood welled up, not arterial, not yet. She inserted the catheter. The plastic tube slid into the trachea. She removed the needle. The pen barrel from the crash cart desk was already in her other hand. She'd practiced this with a ballpoint 12 years ago in the Hindu Kush, and the muscle memory was a ghost that moved through her joints. The barrel fit. Clicked into the catheter hub. Secure it, she said to the respiratory therapist, her voice dropping an octave, the voice of someone who had held living tissue together while explosions lit the sky orange. The therapist moved. Brooke stepped back. The oxygen delivery system was already running. She watched the monitor. The oxygen saturation climbed. 62, 68, 75, 82, 88, 94. The soldier's chest began to rise again. Slow. Then steady. The ventilator hissed synchronized with his lungs, the sound of air escaping and rescuing in the same breath. The ER went silent in a way that made the fluorescent light sound like artillery. The respiratory therapist's mouth was open. The nurse standing by the forestand had gone pale. A medical student in the corner was staring at Brooke's hands as if they'd sprouted extra fingers. The monitor stabilized at a rhythm that meant living. Then boots. Dr. Pierce's shoes, Italian leather, probably $1,200, shined to a mirror finish, hit the tile floor like a judgment. He'd been in the building. Someone had called him. Someone had said, "There's a problem in Trauma Bay 3. He stopped at the edge of the bed. His face cycled through recognition, confusion, and then a purple rage that made his voice vibrate. "You performed a surgical procedure." His teeth were clenched. Without authorization. Without a physician order. Without. His oxygen saturation was 62 and falling. Brooke's voice was steady. He was dying. You practiced outside your scope of practice. Each word was a blade. This hospital has protocols. We have procedures. You do not perform surgical interventions. That is not your role. You are a nurse. A nurse takes orders. A nurse does not. He stopped. Because the soldier's hand had moved. Just slightly. His fingers twitched toward consciousness, toward the reality of being alive because someone had refused to wait for permission. Dr. Pierce's jaw clenched. His hands formed fists at his sides. For 3 seconds, he stood there, the image of a man who had been stripped of narrative control, who had expected to walk in and find a body instead of a save. You are suspended. His voice was steady now, controlled, surgical in a different way, the way of someone who had already decided on amputation. Effective immediately. You performed a procedure outside your nursing scope. You will surrender your badge. You will surrender your access credentials. You will not set foot on this hospital campus pending a formal investigation into patient safety violations. Security will escort you from the building. Brooke removed her gloves. The latex snapped like a small gunshot. She set them on the edge of the bed. Her badge, 5 years of shift work, of holding people's hands while they died, of charting meticulous notes that no one would ever read, came off her scrubbed neck and went into her pocket. The soldier lives, she said. Not a question. Not a defense. Just fact, delivered flat and without inflection. That doesn't excuse what you just did, Dr. Pierce said. She didn't answer. 2 security guards appeared as if they'd been waiting in the wings of a script written long before she arrived in Denver. One was tall, uncomfortable. One was older, with the bearing of someone who'd worked trauma units long enough to recognize the scars on a person's hands. The older guard met her eyes. Something passed between them, a nod so slight it might have been a shadow. She walked toward the exit. As she passed the soldier's bed, his eyes flickered. Just for a moment. He was surfacing from sedation like a swimmer breaking through black water. His pupils focused. He looked directly at her with the kind of recognition that made her blood freeze, not conscious, but deep. The ancient part of the brain that remembers faces that have saved your life. She didn't stop walking. The security guards flanked her. The ER doors slid open. The Denver evening was cold, approaching October, and the air smelled like diesel exhaust and the rain that was beginning to fall in the distance, the kind of rain that sounds like applause on asphalt. She drove home with both hands on the wheel. The house was small, a rental in the suburbs, chosen because it was forgettable. Beige. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen that faced the backyard. No neighbors close enough to ask questions. Her daughter, Emma, was at a friend's house. She wasn't due home until 8. Brooke sat in the car in the driveway for 17 minutes. She told herself she had saved a man. She told herself that the man was alive because she had moved instead of frozen, because somewhere in her muscle memory lived a person the military had erased from every record, every document, every official acknowledgement of existence. She told herself that protocol didn't matter when someone was dying. At 7:51 p.m., her phone buzzed. Emma's mother at the friend's house. Can we keep her until 8:30? The kids want to watch a movie. Brooke texted back, yes. She can sleep over if she wants. Because she needed time. She needed to sit in the dark and hold the thing that Dr. Pierce couldn't touch, the thing that survived every investigation, every written warning, every careful erasure. She went to the bedroom closet. Behind the hanging clothes, in a wooden box that had once held a cigar her father never smoked, was the flag. It was folded into a triangle. Creases sharp as knife edges. The red and blue were faded from being held too many times, from being pressed against her chest during funerals she never attended officially, from being the only proof that a captain named Brooke Sullivan had ever existed at all. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen. Hindu Kush, 2019. 23 years old. From Sacramento. He had a sister who was getting married. He had written a letter to her, and Brooke had been the last person to read it because he'd been the last to ask her to read it, because in those final moments before the medevac came, he'd wanted someone to witness that he was loved. She'd kept the flag because regulation said that when a service member dies in theater, you fold the flag into a triangle. You don't send it home. You don't let anyone see it. You disappear. You bury it in a place where nobody can find it. She'd kept it because it was the only thing that proved she'd been real. At 2:13 a.m., Brooke was still sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, the flag clutched in both hands, shoulders shaking with something that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite rage. It was the sound of someone whose body remembered a life that had been legally declared non-existent. She heard Emma's key in the lock. The light came on. Emma, 10 years old, wearing pajamas and holding her backpack, stopped in the kitchen doorway. Mom? Why are you home early? Why are you sitting in the dark? Brooke couldn't answer. She couldn't explain the suspension. She couldn't explain the military erasure. She couldn't explain that Captain Brooke Sullivan had performed a surgical procedure in 2019 and then been ordered to vanish, and that vanishing meant watching people die because she couldn't use the skills that had kept soldiers alive. She couldn't explain that today, in the span of 90 seconds, she'd saved someone using the person the military had erased, and now they were coming for her again. She set the flag carefully on the table. "Come here," she whispered. Emma came to her. She was still young enough that she believed her mother when her mother said everything would be fine. Brooke held her close and breathed in the smell of her daughter's hair, shampoo and safety and the simple uncomplicated love of a child who didn't know that her mother had been trained to kill, trained to survive, trained to do things that were never supposed to exist in official records. "Why are you home early?" Emma asked again. "Administrative stuff," Brooke said. "Nothing you need to worry about, baby. Go back to sleep." "Are you okay?" "Yes," Brooke lied. "I'm okay." She held Emma until the girl's breathing steadied, until she drifted toward sleep. Then she carried her to bed, tucked the covers up to her chin, and went back to the kitchen table. The flag was still there. At 2:22 a.m., The kitchen was so quiet you could hear the electric hum of the refrigerator, and Brooke understood something with perfect clarity. She'd kept the flag because she knew, somewhere in the part of her brain that still remembered how to survive, that this day would come. The day when the person they'd erased would save someone. The day when someone would recognize her. The day when being invisible would no longer be possible. She folded the flag tighter. Creases so sharp they could have cut skin. The doorbell didn't ring. No one came. The night stretched on toward a dawn she could not yet see, and Brooke Sullivan sat in the darkness with the only proof she'd ever existed, waiting for the world to catch up to what she'd always known. That there were some things buried so deep that they could not stay down. That some ghosts wore scrubs. That the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. The soldier returned on a Tuesday afternoon, his discharge paperwork tucked under one arm, color finally returning to his face after 4 days of fluids and blood products that Brooke had personally helped source through the hospital's emergency reserves. He was walking now, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body was still cataloging damage, when he saw her in the corridor outside his room. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. That's all it took. His voice was barely a whisper, meant only for her, but Dr. Pierce was 3 feet away reviewing the chart at the nurse's station. The soldier leaned slightly toward Brooke as he passed, close enough that only she could hear the words that would change everything. Valkyrie. Hindu Kush, 2019. Her operational code name. The one that was supposed to be buried in a classified file in a Pentagon basement, known only to 7 people on the planet. The one that had no connection to the name stitched on her hospital badge. Her hands continued moving through the vital signs documentation without a tremor, without hesitation, without giving anything away. But her breath caught for exactly 1 heartbeat. Just one. Dr. Pierce's head snapped up. He'd heard something in the soldier's voice, recognition, reverence, familiarity, the kind of tone you used when you were speaking to someone you trusted with your life. His eyes narrowed. He closed the chart with a sharp snap that echoed down the hallway like a gunshot. That's when the Marine colonel walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of authority that made the hospital air pressure change. His uniform was dress blues, immaculate, with the insignia of a full colonel on his shoulders. He'd been visiting another patient down the hall when he overheard the exchange. Now he was walking directly toward the soldier, his phone already in his hand, the light from the screen illuminating his face as he scrolled to something he'd apparently been looking for. Captain Brooke Sullivan, the colonel said, his voice pitched to carry but not to shout. He wasn't looking at Brooke. He was looking at Dr. Pierce. Reading from the phone with the measured cadence of someone reading an official citation. Silver Star. For conspicuous gallantry under fire while extracting 12 hostages from an insurgent compound in Paktia province on the night of October 14, 2019. Under sustained small arms and mortar fire, Captain Sullivan coordinated the extraction of non-combatants while maintaining defensive positions against a numerically superior enemy force. Her tactical decisions prevented casualties and secured the safe passage of all personnel. The colonel looked up from the phone. His eyes found Dr. Pierce. They were the color of winter rain. This is the nurse you suspended for practicing outside her scope. Dr. Pierce's face went white. Not pale. White. Like someone had just drained every drop of blood from his head. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, but nothing came out except a strangled sound that wasn't quite a word. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical hum. The ventilators wheezed their rhythmic breath. The heart monitors beeped their steady confirmation that people were still alive. And in the silence between those sounds, the entire floor of St. Michael's Hospital seemed to hold its breath. Then the elevator doors opened. A 2-star general stepped out. Not walked. Stepped out like the air itself had moved to make room for him. His uniform was parade dress, his medals were real, and the way the colonel and the Marine patient both went rigid suggested that something had shifted in the universe's gravitational field. Behind the general came 2 men in dark suits who carried the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, the kind who'd spent years not being noticed until the exact moment they needed to be noticed. The general walked directly to Brooke. Not to Dr. Pierce. Not to the colonel. Directly to her. He saluted. Not a casual military gesture. A full, formal salute, his right hand snapping to his brow with the precision of someone who'd been doing it for 40 years. His eyes held hers, and in that moment, she understood that he was saluting not the nurse in scrubs, but the captain he'd spent for years pretending didn't exist. Captain Sullivan. Welcome back. The words were simple. The weight behind them was immeasurable. One of the dark-suited men stepped forward. He didn't introduce himself because his presence was introduction enough. Your operational code name has been confirmed through secure channels. The Pentagon is aware that your classified asset status was compromised on hospital security footage approximately 37 minutes ago when Dr. Pierce made the disclosure in front of multiple witnesses. The hospital administrator is being notified as we speak that this constitutes a federal security breach. Dr. Pierce made a sound like something breaking inside him. His hand started shaking, the real kind, the kind that came from knowing your entire world was collapsing in real time. I didn't know. I didn't understand. She's just a nurse. I thought the citation was some kind of. What you thought, the general said, his voice like a vault closing, is no longer relevant. The second federal agent was already on his phone, speaking in the rapid, efficient shorthand of someone reporting to someone else far more important. Security footage. Chain of custody. Evidence preservation. The hospital administrator was going to be in a federal interview room by nightfall, and Dr. Pierce's personnel file was about to become part of an investigation that would make his life look like a very small thing in a very large machine. Brooke stood perfectly still. Her hands remained at her sides. Her face showed nothing. The composure she'd learned on the Hindu Kush, the ability to receive impossible news and keep breathing, to absorb catastrophe and continue functioning, held her upright while everything else collapsed around her. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Pierce. The worst part came 3 days later. The soldier's daughter had filmed the entire interaction. She'd been visiting her father when he was being discharged, and she'd recorded Dr. Pierce's voice from earlier in the day, the audio quality slightly degraded, the angle slightly off, but the words perfectly, devastatingly clear. His voice screaming at Brooke in room 614. Calling her charity case. Questioning her basic competence. Demanding she explain herself while he stood close enough that his saliva sprayed across her face and she didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't blink. The daughter posted the video to Instagram with a caption that spread like wildfire. This doctor screamed at the nurse who saved my father's life. Turns out she's a decorated war hero. He called her charity case. 1 million views by midnight. 5 million by morning. The video appeared on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, platforms where it was shared by nurses, veterans, military families, and ordinary people who recognized cruelty when they saw it recorded in crystalline 4K video. Local news outlets picked it up. National news outlets amplified it. The clip was edited down to 60 seconds and set to the sound of helicopter rotors and the national anthem, and suddenly Dr. Marcus Pierce was the face of healthcare gone wrong. Then came the email that destroyed him. Dr. Harrison Whitmore, a retired surgeon who'd been Dr. Pierce's mentor at Johns Hopkins 27 years earlier, released a public statement. Whitmore had published over 400 peer-reviewed articles. He'd trained 3 generations of surgeons. His opinion on matters of medical ethics carried the kind of weight that moved state licensing boards like invisible hands on a chessboard. I am ashamed to have trained Dr. Marcus Pierce. His conduct as documented in recent video evidence is a disgrace to the medical profession and an affront to the nurses who work beside him. I hereby disown any association with him and call for immediate investigation into his fitness to practice medicine. 48 hours later, federal auditors arrived at St. Michael's. They came with warrants and subpoenas and the kind of institutional authority that made hospital administrators cooperate with the speed of people who understood the alternative was far worse. They went directly to the billing department. They pulled surgical records going back 7 years. They cross-referenced procedure codes with actual surgical time logs. And they found exactly what Brooke had seen in those charts, what she'd tried to tell the system, what the system had refused to hear. Dr. Pierce had been inflating surgical billing codes on approximately 374 procedures. Conservative estimate, $847,000 in fraudulent claims. Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance carriers, all of it funneled into accounts he'd opened under his brother-in-law's name. The fraud investigation expanded. The insurance fraud expanded. The federal charges expanded. 18 counts. Wire fraud. Healthcare fraud. Conspiracy. By the time the agents escorted Dr. Pierce from the building, he was no longer a doctor. He was a defendant. His medical license was stripped within 30 days. The state licensing board didn't even schedule a formal hearing, they just revoked it on the basis of criminal charges and criminal conduct unbecoming the profession. Dr. Pierce made one appearance in federal court, represented by a public defender because his assets had been frozen, and he was released on his own recognizance pending trial. The bail conditions included a prohibition on working in any healthcare capacity or in any capacity involving direct contact with vulnerable populations. The only work that would take him after that was a community college 8 miles south of Denver that needed someone to teach CPR fundamentals for $12 an hour. Brooke didn't follow the legal proceedings in detail. She didn't need to. The hospital offered her reinstatement and back pay, a number with 6 figures and a lot of zeros. She declined. The Pentagon offered her something better, a training position at Fort Carson, working with the 1st SFOD Delta, teaching combat medicine to the next generation of Special Forces medics. A role that let her use her hands and her skills and her knowledge without hiding who she was. She accepted. Her daughter asked one question, "Mom, were you really a soldier?" Brooke showed her the folded flag. Showed her the captain's bars. And said, "I was. And I'm sorry I couldn't tell you." Her daughter hugged her and whispered, "You're the coolest person I know." 6 months later, Brooke walked through the St. Michael's cafeteria in civilian scrubs with captain's bars pinned directly to the collar, a compromise the Pentagon had negotiated, acknowledgement of her service without full uniform, the ability to exist publicly as both nurse and captain instead of one or the other. She was picking up coffee before her shift at Fort Carson, before she went to teach a classroom of hardened combat medics how to perform emergency surgical airway management in scenarios so close to reality that the line between training and deployment became theoretical. Through the cafeteria window, she saw Dr. Pierce. He was shuffling past the building in a faded community college polo shirt, a lanyard around his neck with his name badge clipped to it. He was heading toward the education building where he taught CPR certification courses to high school students and hospital volunteers who'd never set foot in an operating room, people who needed to know how to count chest compressions and when to shock with defibrillators. That was his life now. Minimum wage. No prestige. No power. No institution willing to give him authority over anyone or anything that mattered. He didn't look up as he passed the window. Didn't see her watching. Didn't know that the woman whose career he'd tried to destroy was standing 5 feet away, pinning captain's bars to her scrubs, preparing to teach surgeons and operators and people who'd already killed and saved lives in places he couldn't imagine. Brooke felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Not triumph. Just the quiet recognition that some people destroy themselves, and sometimes you get to watch it happen from a safe distance while you rebuild your own life into something unbreakable. The combat medic from Fort Carson, the one who'd recognized her technique on her first day back at the hospital, stopped by her table. He was holding a training schedule. His eyes were clear, his posture was straight, and the respect in his voice was absolute. "Captain Sullivan. I signed up for the advanced trauma course like you said. When do we start?" She met his gaze with the full weight of everything she'd survived. "Monday. 0600. Don't be late." He grinned, a real grin, the kind that acknowledged he understood exactly what kind of training he was about to receive and was genuinely looking forward to it. Wouldn't dream of it. That night, Brooke sat with her daughter and helped with homework, the folded flag now displayed on the mantel instead of hidden in a locker. It was a reminder that some things stay buried, and some things refuse to stay down. Her daughter asked what it was like, serving. Brooke thought for a long moment, then said, "It was the hardest thing I ever did. And I'd do it again." As she tucked her daughter into bed, she whispered to herself in the darkness of the hallway, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. And for the first time in 4 years, she slept through the night. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd actually survived? We'd love to hear your story.